I feel that without some story that's going to make sense of our catastrophe, and knowing, as you say, the kin feeling of there being ancestors or people that had gone through this catastrophe before, unless we can, have a story, or it doesn't have to be one, that can help us go down and still remain human. We can still carry that fire of being a real human being. It's going to be very difficult as the years increase. It's already difficult. I mean, it's already really hard. And the hardest thing is to realize we're in it. We have to recognize we're living in an age of endings, and story helps us do that. So that's why I'm thinking exchanging stories and finding one that works on an individual and a collective level is possibly the most important. Well, I would say that I'm a writer. One of the most important things to, I don't know whether seek is the right word, but actually as you say, often say willing, let us be willing to hear it. And is there any such story that you've come across?
Well, I'm not a person any longer who's committed, particular stories from some canon or other to memory. I've found that what I've done, particularly as a consequence of having a school in the glory days when we could congregate, was that everything began to occur to me in a storied fashion. So rather than talking about stories, my tendency for a long time now has been to speak in a storied fashion about things that don't seem to give way to that understanding in an overt way. I should say that the notion that stories help us, that's the word I'd like to isolate for a moment and wonder about it, and suggest something like this. You mentioned I worked in the death trade for a long time, and man, you want to talk about a place that's bereft of storytelling for real. The death trade is one such place. So one of the things that I found routinely there is people were counting on the idea that things working out was the same thing as being able to derive comfort and a sense of reassurance that all shall be well. Okay, now here's what it actually means. Things working out means if you're lucky, you'll die on schedule. On schedule means that the circuitry is dictating that this is basically your time. And almost certainly that time is not going to be commensurate with your sense that it's your time. In other words, you won't get a vote and you won't agree. Okay, this is a terrible conundrum for people who are addicted to self-determination. And so, I live in a country now that's legalized euthanasia, though they don't call it that, but that's what it used to be called. And lo and behold, the death fears that allegedly prompted euthanasia in the first place remain intact, if not strengthened by the practice of euthanasia. The moral of the story, if you will, is something like this. If you are in deep obedience to life, you will end and life will continue. But man, you really need to live in a place that's fundamentally animistic to be able to pull that off. And generally speaking, most North Americans do not live in an animistic, mythic universe. They live in animism incarnate, right? And so what it comes down to is it's only working out if it's working out for me. And it only works for me if it's consistent with what I want for myself when I want it, in the degree that I want it. Yeah. So I wrote a piece for a Swedish filmmaker recently, and there's a refrain. It's about stillness. And there's a refrain in there. I'm thinking about nuns and monks and mendicants and their desire to leave the world behind in order to achieve some kind of peace of mind and stillness and the rest. And I characterized a prayer that they involuntarily probably back into that goes something like this. So we pray for clarity and we get it, and it's too much. And so we pray for mercy instead, and we get it, and it's not enough. And we pray for clarity then instead, and we get it, and it's too much, and we pray. Okay. That's the kind of, how should I put it, unachieved pseudo story that most dying people that I was lucky enough to attend were living by, if you can call that living. So the point I'm raising here is that you are deeply unlikely to be comforted if you are a citizen or a product of an inanimistic culture by stories, because stories are allies to life. They're not allies to self-determination for human beings.
Wow. Okay.
To that extent, I will go further and say the very best stories are not human. The very best stories give humans a chance to see themselves in there, but they're not principally human artifacts.
Yes, that's great. I agree. And but as you say, the ability to listen to that and to let it in is also a skill. And I feel that, as you were saying, that these things exist in a sentient understanding of the world being sentient and animate. And I know that it wasn't so much about remembrance or going back, and I don't really mean that. I mean, how do you remember that within your creaturehood? Is that something you teach at the school? How to remember a state of remembering of the animate world, or
the verb to remember literally means to bring back together again that which was once intact and was subsequently dismembered.
Right.
That's the opposite. Not forget. Dismember is the opposite of remember. And there was a primordial state called member. We don't actually use this as a verb any longer, just as an adjective and a noun kind of thing. So remembering has a degree of nostalgia, if you will, associated with it. It's oftentimes involuntary. I think I said this early on in our talk here, and happily say again in a different way, that the insistence that these things are there for us to remember them assumes that at one time we knew them, and that somehow we've, quote, just temporarily misplaced them through misadventure or something, and they're just waiting on the shelf for us to pick them up again and proceed in a more comely fashion. So I'm just going to go on record here and risk adamance and say this. I don't think that's true. I don't think it's even recognizably true. I think it's a kind of unacknowledged wish pattern that we have. Anybody that was raised in the Judeo-Christian tradition or was exposed to it through the consumer culture invariably has this notion that there was a time that was bordering on the perfect, which you could just call Eden, right? And everybody has a notion of this that was somehow true about themselves in their own personal lives, usually some unviolated portion of our childhood. And when you listen to people evoke this idea involuntarily, it's often in the form of restoring, rewilding, reacquiring, remembering. And the assumption is that you were there once. And since you were there once, you can be there twice. And all you've got to do is find the magic formula, get to the magic school, take the magic weekend workshop, whatever it is, the magic ayahuasca, and you'll get there again. And, all shall be revealed and the veil shall be rent properly so, and so forth. This is, I think this is demonstrably, culturally speaking, not there. It's not there. We're insisting that it's there to make the current regime livable. But what if the current regime is not livable? And we're failing to recognize its unlivability, its literal unsustainability, by virtue of our hankering after this idea that once we had it figured out, that once we were living in accordance with these things that you and I have alluded to during the course of the last hour or so. Because that's my suspicion, that the more sort of sepia-toned, melancholic longing after an old intactness you invoke, the less likely you are to find the current order and the spirit work that it requires of us compelling or possible.
Yeah, because you're not present in what's happening now. Is that what you're saying? However, not that I'm having an argument, but I do feel that there is something, however, having been brought up, in a city, and I now have been living in the countryside for many years and traveled for many years, having very different relationships with different territories. I don't know what you would call it. Maybe it isn't memory, but I'm not the person I used to be. I used to be a fashion editor in a magazine in the city. I'm obviously not doing that anymore. But my relationship with creatures, with plants, with territory, it feels like something that I've remembered to go, and it's not going back into an animate world. It's just, it's being revealed to me because I've opened to it. So I don't think it's pristine, but it is in communication. And I feel that what you've been saying about story is that is, and now I'm wary of using any word with RE in front of it. It's reminding me of, as good story does, reminding me of that non-human teacher, ancestor work that we need to engage in. And if that's not memory, what is that? Because we do, something in us goes, yeah, this feels right. This I know. Deep in my bones, I know this. But I wasn't told it when I was a kid.
This is guesswork now. So I'm happy to guess along with you and say, imagine something like this. You're familiar with the Argentinian writer Borges?
Yes.
Okay. So in one of his most arresting stories, the name of which I can't recall at the moment, he suggests that we are on the receiving end of being remembered, but we don't know it.
Oh.
And so we mistake us being remembered for our lives. It's a very arresting proposition.
That is nice, yeah.
That we're actually being remembered, and this is what it looks like. And the only thing that's missing is our capacity to obey being a memory instead of trying to have memories. So, I mean, a lot of people are very unhinged by that prospect because the notion of personal agency, well, is put in its proper place. It's not that significant, But I mean, I'm very compelled with the notion of it, that what you alluded to a minute ago, knowing in your bones, this kind of thing, that sense is a consequence of this. This might begin to sound very esoteric to a casual listener. I'm going to see if I can say it simply. The idea is this: there are principalities and powers alive in the world. They constitute the world. We speak of them at some distance from us, as if in so doing we can maintain the distance and have something to say, and perhaps even decisions to make around to what degree we allow that in. And this order of understanding that I'm suggesting now suggests something closer to this, that even our inability to remember that we are a memory of our own ancestry, that's what we are. We're being remembered by our ancestors, which completely screws up our understanding of time and space because, in English, even it's in our grammar, past, present, future, that's the sequence. You can't really go back except in your, quote, imagination. And imagination and memory are radically different things, this order would have us believe. In actual fact, our ancestors knew of our coming more than we know of their having been. Because to us, they're gone, and to them, we were coming. It's an amazing thought to think.
Yeah, it's cool.
I don't even care if it's not true. It's so enthusiastically useful to cultivate some sense of humility in the current order of things, which, man, we could really use a lot of humility, you know, and trade in our humiliation for humility instead.
That is so true. And so in the sense of it being kin, it's like we are our own kin. And what you're saying is that the ancestor of which we are revealing, coming from, being now in this clock time, in this now time, that is possibly the radical act of kinship that we really need to, I don't want to use the word cultivate, but
be claimed by.
Be claimed by, yeah. Be absolutely open to it and go, because it is mysterious. And Book has said at one moment, he did an interview once on British television, and you know he used to speak Anglo-Saxon fluently. I mean, nobody speaks Anglo-Saxon, let alone Latin, but it was like amazing. Anyway, he leans into the camera at one point. He goes, "Time is the great mystery on earth," and I was like, yeah. Yeah, you can see it.
You're familiar with the word totem?
Yes.
Okay, it actually comes from where the people who inhabited this place I'm sitting in right now. And it's slightly mispronounced, so it's do-dem with the D, it's a softer sound. You're familiar with the idea of a totem pole?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to tell you a very brief story. I don't know how much longer we've got here, speaking of time, but...
Enough time for a story, for sure.
All right, okay. This is a true story, what I'm going to tell you. And it really happened too. Okay, and it goes like this. So if you look at these totem poles, you will find that the mythic characters outnumber the humans many, many, many times. In fact, you could go further and say it's rare to see a human being in a totem pole. Why is that? Well, you could be very self-centered and say, we make them, that's plenty. Or you could think a different thought and say, well, you have to understand what a totem pole is. Do-dem is the word ancestor or clan of ancestry. So this is kind of what it means, okay? And when people in my part of the world here go into ceremonial precinct, they introduce themselves to the unseen with a quote unquote an Indian name that they don't use in normal business and so on, and their clan affiliation, which is virtually all the time an animal affiliation. In other words, when they're citing their own ancestry, they go to an animal, not to a human. So what does that mean? What have they realized, and are they capable of living that we can't even remember? I suggest it's this. The reason that they have an animal as their first ancestor is because their understanding of the dynamics or the mechanics of ancestry are to be found in the function of sustenance. Okay? So whatever sustained you is your ancestor, and whatever sustained your first human ancestor is your ancestor. Because they stand in the sequence of sustenance, mutual sustenance. See? So what this means then is there is no dilemma for the Aboriginal understanding here that somehow a bear carried your entire lineage on his or her back, right? There's no leap of faith that you have to make there, because your understanding is that your lineage is borne along by whatever sustained it. So fundamentally, lineage or ancestry is a verb, not a noun. And so your sense of belonging is a consequence of recognizing how fundamentally dependent you are to the scheme and the sequence of sustenance that reaches back into time and tethers you to them.
Right.
It's just an extraordinarily, achingly beautiful thing that happens from their point of view to be absolutely true. And it's one of the things that, strangers to the continent have never, quote unquote, understood. They can even tell the story, but they can't live it. Mm. Why? Because their sequence of sustenance does not go to a bear, an elk, or a deer on this continent. That's why. And this is one of the great things we lost when we came across in the Middle Passage, is that the story of sustaining that is the real story. The sequence of sustenance is the storyness that we've been alluding to this whole time we've been talking.
Absolutely, because it is, I mean, if you go to the caves in France, there's very, very ancient caves. There are no pictures of human beings. I mean, it's all animals, all of them, which they did in the dark, So this is thousands and thousands of years. I mean, these are our connections. Yeah, that's a lovely story. Thank you, Stephen. It's fantastic.